In the winter of 1986, a diver named Kihachiro Aratake slipped into the water off a tiny Japanese island called Yonaguni. He was not looking for history, he ran boat tours for a living, and he was hunting for a new spot where visitors could watch the hammerhead sharks that gather in those waters every year. The sea that day was clear as glass, and about 80 feet down he saw something that stopped him cold. Below him stood a wall of stone, flat terraces, sharp corners, a long flight of steps climbing up toward the surface, as if someone had built a temple and the ocean had swallowed it whole. It looked like the ruins of a lost city. At least, that is what it looked like. But this story does not really start off the coast of Japan. It starts with a question people have been asking for as long as they have stood on a shore and watched the tide go out. When you find something strange under the water, something with straight lines and right angles that feel a little too neat, how do you know whether the sea carved it or whether a human being did? Because the ocean is very good at imitating us, and we are very good at seeing buildings and meaning in places where there may be none. All around the world, structures sit right on that line. Some have turned out to be nothing at all. Some have turned out to be real and far older than anyone expected. And a few, even now, no one has been able to explain. Today we go down to look at the ones that still do not have an answer, starting with the wall that Arataki found. Word of his discovery spread fast. Divers, film crews, and journalists made the difficult trip out to see it for themselves. The island sits far out in the East China Sea, ringed by strong currents, and the site is a hard dive even for experts. But the payoff was extraordinary. The formation is enormous, longer than a football field and about as tall as an 8-story building, all of it pale sandstone, and the closer people looked, the stranger it got. Among the scientists who came was Professor Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus. Kimura dived the site again and again for the better part of 20 years, and he became convinced of something remarkable. To him, this was not a rock, it was a ruin. He pointed to a feature that looks like the front gate of a castle, a stone tunnel you can swim through. He pointed to a wide, flat terrace big enough to hold thousands of people, to what looked like a road, and to 2 rounded stones he believed were shaped like turtles standing guard. In old Japanese folklore, a dragon god lives in a palace beneath the sea, watched over by turtles. To Kimura, a monument important enough to be guarded had to be the work of human hands. He estimated it was carved more than 5,000 years ago, back during the last ice age, when the sea was lower and this ground was dry land. Then the water rose and took it. If he was right, it would mean a lost civilization had built something on the scale of a castle before the pyramids of Egypt even existed. So the question genuinely mattered. Was it real? Then a closer look revealed something else. When geologists studied the formation in fine detail, the edges that seemed so carved and so straight turned out to be unbroken. The monument is not built from separate blocks stacked by people. It is one solid piece of rock connected all the way down to the seabed and to the cliffs on the shore behind it. And that is the key. The stone here is sandstone, and sandstone has a habit. When it is put under stress, during an earthquake for instance, it fractures along clean straight lines and flat plains. Do that underwater, let the current wash away all the loose debris, and you are left with sharp terraces and what look for all the world like steps. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, dived the site and came away with a firm conclusion. He found it fascinating but not mysterious in its origin. The same shapes turn up in the natural rock on the shore nearby, form the same way. There were no tool marks, there was no pottery, no clear sign that anyone had ever actually lived there. For most scientists, that was enough. Yonaguni is a natural formation, sculpted by earthquakes and the sea into something that only looks designed. And yet, Professor Kimura never changed his mind. To this day, he remains convinced the monument was shaped by his ancestors, and he is still out there searching for the proof that would turn the doubters around. Which is the odd thing about Yonaguni. The most qualified people who have studied it in person still cannot fully agree on what it is. But Japan is only one place on a very long list. Halfway around the world, off the coast of India, a different discovery raised a far bigger question. Not whether an ancient people carved a single hill of rock, but whether we have the entire timeline of human civilization wrong. In the year 2000, a team from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology was running a routine survey in the Gulf of Khambhat, a wide bay in the Arabian Sea off the state of Gujarat. They were not hunting for ruins. They were studying pollution and water conditions, dragging sonar equipment across the seabed, and the sonar came back with something nobody expected. Down in the murk, about 130 feet below the surface, the instruments traced out geometric shapes. Regular ones, straight lines and right angles, spread across miles of seafloor, in a pattern that looked less like nature and more like the foundations of a town. In May of 2001, India's science minister announced that the ruins of an ancient civilization had been found off the coast of Gujarat. Something, he said, older than the Indus Valley, older than the oldest cities anyone had ever documented. The team went back and lowered dredging equipment to scoop up whatever they could from the bottom. They brought up pottery, weathered stones that looked like simple tools, fossil bone, a human tooth, and a piece of wood. And when that piece of wood was sent away for carbon dating, the result stopped people in their tracks. It came back at roughly 9,500 years old. Sit with that number for a second. The first great cities of Mesopotamia appear in the record around 4,500 years ago. If there really was a town in the Gulf of Khambhat that old, it would be nearly twice the age of the oldest cities we know, and it would mean people were building on that scale thousands of years earlier than the textbooks say. That is the kind of claim that rewrites history, and that is exactly why it ran into a wall. Because there is a serious problem with how the evidence was gathered. Those artifacts were not carefully excavated where they lay. They were dredged, scooped up off the bottom by a machine, which means no one can prove they actually belong to the shapes on the sonar. That old piece of wood might have drifted in from somewhere else, or been lying on that seabed long before any structure existed, if a structure ever existed at all. And there is something else that is hard to argue with. Not a single marine archaeologist has ever gone down and examined the site in person. Everything we know about the Gulf of Khambhat rests on sonar images and a bucket of loose material pulled up out of the dark. Some even question whether those so-called stone tools are tools at all, or just oddly shaped rocks. So here is where it stands. It might be the oldest city ever found, a discovery that would change everything we believe about our own past, or it might be a pattern in the mud that our eyes and our sonar turned into a city. More than 20 years later, nobody has gone down to find out for sure. If the site off India is a mystery hiding in shallow water, the next one is hiding somewhere far harder to reach. And of everything on this list, it is the one that even the skeptics admit they cannot explain. It begins the same quiet way. In the year 2000, a Canadian company was mapping the seabed for the Cuban government off the western tip of the island near a place called the Guanajuatabibes Peninsula. The team, led by two marine engineers named Paulina Zelitsky and Paul Weinsweig, was searching for sunken Spanish treasure ships. Their survey vessel was dragging side-scan sonar across a deep, flat plain of sand when the empty seabed suddenly gave way to something that should not have been there. On the screen were shapes, large geometric stone shapes, laid out in what looked like a pattern across the bottom, blocks that appeared cut and stacked, formations that looked like pyramids, circles, what seemed to be the outlines of streets and rooms. Zelitsky later said her first reaction was not excitement, but a kind of fear, a sense that they were seeing something they were not meant to see. And here is the part that makes it so hard to explain. This was not shallow water. The shapes were sitting around 2,000 feet down, in the cold dark far below where any sunlight reaches. They knew a blurry sonar image would convince no one, so they came back with better tools. They brought along a Cuban government geologist named Manuel Iturralde, one of the most respected earth scientists on the island, and they lowered a remotely operated vehicle, a robot on a cable with cameras and lights, down into the dark to film whatever was there. And the footage showed enormous blocks of pale granite-like stone, some of them roughly 10 feet across, a few stacked one on top of another, resting on the seafloor in the shape the sonar had promised. Now everyone involved was careful. Zelitsky refused to call it Atlantis, and refused to call it a city until there was proof. But even the cautious voices could not make the real problem go away, and the problem is the depth. Think about it for a moment. For a city to be sitting 2,000 feet underwater, the land it was built on would have had to drop 2,000 feet, or the sea would have had to rise that far. At the height of the last ice age, when the oceans were at their very lowest, the sea was only around 400 feet lower than it is today, not 2,000. There is no known process that gently lowers a human city that deep and leaves the buildings recognizable. An underwater archaeologist from Florida State University put it plainly: if these were really ruins, they would be far more advanced than anything else in the Americas from that time. They are, in his words, out of time and out of place. If you are finding this as fascinating as I am, take 1 second to subscribe. I make deep dive documentaries on the ocean and the mysteries in it every single week, and I would love to have you along. Now back down to the bottom off the coast of Cuba. So what are those shapes really? And this is the honest answer. Nobody knows. The Cuban geologist who saw the footage, a man with every professional reason to be skeptical, admitted it was unlike anything he had ever seen, and said flatly that he did not have an explanation for it. It could be some bizarre natural formation that has never been documented anywhere else. There is only one way to ever know for certain, and it is the strangest twist in the whole story. No one has gone back. In more than 20 years, there has been no full expedition, no proper excavation, no answer. Political trouble, money, and the sheer difficulty of working. That deep all got in the way, and the site simply faded out of the news. Somewhere off the coast of Cuba, in the dark, those shapes are still sitting there right now, exactly as they were found. Photographed once, explained never. The strangest thing about these underwater puzzles is that you do not have to travel to a remote island or go half a mile down to find one. There is one sitting in about 40 feet of fresh water in a bay in the northern United States. In the spring of 2007, an underwater archaeologist named Mark Hawley was surveying the bottom of Grand Traverse Bay, an arm of Lake Michigan. He was looking for shipwrecks, the way you do in the Great Lakes, when his sonar picked up a line of stones running across the sandy bottom. Not a random scatter, a line more than a mile long curving across the lake bed, the stones set in what looked like a deliberate arrangement, some of them small as a basketball, some as big as a compact car, and near the middle a ring of larger stones. That alone would have been interesting. But when Hawley reviewed the photographs, one boulder stopped him. On its surface was what looked like a carving of an animal, and not just any animal. It looked like a mastodon, the great shaggy elephant-like beast that once roamed North America and went extinct more than 11,000 years ago. Think about what that would mean. You cannot carve a picture of an animal from memory if that animal died out before you were born. If the carving is real, then a human being once stood on that spot and etched a living mastodon into stone, which would place the whole arrangement at somewhere around 9,000 years old, back when the lake bed was dry ground and the water had not yet risen to cover it. That would make it older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. So, what is it? And here the grounded answer is more interesting than the wild ones, and in a way more moving. Hawley himself is careful. He has spent years pushing back on the breathless headlines that call this an underwater Stonehenge. It is not a ring of giant standing stones. It is best described in his own words as a long line of stones, and there is a very human explanation that fits it. A researcher at the University of Michigan named John O'Shea has studied a similar stone structure under nearby Lake Huron, a 9,000-year-old line of rocks and hunting blinds that ancient people built to funnel caribou into a killing ground. The Lake Michigan stones may well be the same kind of thing, a drowned hunting ground laid out by real people on dry land, now resting under the water where they left it. If that is all it is still astonishing. A structure older than almost anything standing above ground, hidden under a lake that millions of Americans have swum in. But that one carving is the piece that keeps it a mystery. To this day, no one has been able to prove whether the mastodon was cut by a human hand or is just a trick of a cracked and stained rock. The experts who could settle it are not trained divers, and so the boulder waits and the argument goes on. One more, this time in the cold water between Sweden and Finland. June 2011. A Swedish team called Ocean X, led by two treasure hunters named Peter Lindberg and Dennis Asberg, was searching the Gulf of Bothnia for old shipwrecks. They had been out for days and were nearly ready to head home when they made one last pass with the sonar. And an image came back that looked like something out of a movie. On the seabed, about 300 feet down, sat a huge circular object, roughly 200 feet across, with a flat top and strange features around its rim. To a lot of people, it looked uncannily like the Millennium Falcon, the spaceship from Star Wars. Stranger still, it seemed to sit at the end of a long flattened track, as if something heavy had skidded across the bottom and come to rest. The internet did what the internet does. Within days, the Baltic Sea Anomaly, as it came to be called, was a crashed flying saucer, a chunk of sunken Atlantis, a secret weapon from the Second World War. But this is one of the cases where science actually got its hands on the evidence. The team brought up rock samples and handed them to a geologist at Stockholm University. And the answer was almost boringly natural. The samples were granite, gneiss, and sandstone, the ordinary stones you would expect in a basin carved out and filled by melting glaciers at the end of the last ice age. There was even a piece of hardened lava in the mix, but nothing the slow grinding work of ice could not explain. Another marine geologist looked at the original sonar and pointed out that the image was simply too low in resolution to trust, that people were reading fine detail into a blur. The scientific consensus landed right where the rocks pointed. It is a glacial formation, a mound of stone and debris dropped by a retreating glacier that happens to have an oddly round shape. And yet notice what happened next. Even with an explanation on the table, the mystery would not die. The site is deep, remote, and hard to reach, so very few independent scientists have ever examined it, and that gap is exactly where doubt lives. To this day, there are people who insist the circle is too perfect, too symmetrical, to be an accident of the ice. Which tells you something, not just about the Baltic Sea, but about us. When you line these places up next to each other, a pattern starts to show through. And it is not a pattern on the seabed, it is a pattern in us. Look at what the words cannot explain actually mean across these 5 sites. Off Japan, the experts who studied Yonaguni in person still cannot agree, though most now believe the sea and the earthquakes did the carving. Off India, nobody has properly gone down to check. Off Cuba, even the skeptics are stumped, and the site has sat untouched for 20 years. In Lake Michigan, one carving has never been confirmed, and in the Baltic, the answer arrived and a lot of people simply did not want to accept it. That last one is the real tell, because the ocean genuinely has swallowed real human history. When the last ice age ended, the sea rose about 400 feet over thousands of years, and it drowned the coastlines where people had actually lived and hunted and built. There are real sunken towns down there. Off the coast of Greece lies a place called Pavlopetri, a genuine Bronze Age town with streets and houses and graves, the oldest sunken city ever found, lost when a series of earthquakes dropped it into the sea. So the instinct is not crazy. Sometimes the strange shapes really are the work of our ancestors, but the sea is also a sculptor. Sandstone splits into steps, methane seeping up through the seabed hardens, mud into rings and columns that look carved by hand. Glaciers drop stones into circles, and we are built deep in our wiring to look at all of it and see a maker at work, because a lost city is a far better story than a broken rock. We want there to be something down there, which is why a diver off Yonaguni in 1986 could look at a wall of fractured stone and see a temple, and why all these years later we still are not completely sure he was wrong. Here is the part worth sitting with. We have mapped the surface of the Moon and Mars in more detail than we have mapped our own seafloor. Most of the ocean bottom has never been seen by human eyes at all, so whatever is really down there off the coast of Cuba, and whatever else is waiting in the dark that no one has stumbled onto yet, the honest truth is that we have barely begun to look. If you want to understand just how completely we turned our backs on the deep, there is another video where I dig into why we stopped exploring the ocean after 1960 and what that choice may have cost us. It is on the screen now. Go take a look, and I will see you down there.